collected notes up here, so I can go ahead and start the briefing for him.
We'll be talking a lot.
Without further ado,
Right, I know where I rank if George puts me last, but
Clean up better.
Nathaniel Green to Francis Marion, April 1781. When I consider how much you have done and suffered, and under what difficulties you have maintained your ground, I am at a loss of what to admire most, your courage and fortitude, or your address and management. Certain it is, no man has a better claim to the public thanks than you have. History affords no instance where an officer has kept possession of a country under so many disadvantages as you have. Surrounded on every side by superior forces, hunted from every quarter with veteran troops, you have found a means to elude their attacks and to keep alive the expiring hopes of an oppressed militia when all succors seem to be cut off. To fight the enemy bravely with the prospect of victory is nothing, but to fight with intrepidity under the constant impression of absolute defeat and inspire irregular troops to do it is a talent peculiar to yourself. So what we're going to do, and we're going to do it, it'll be the fastest one, I hope, but I want you to, I did not know what Rick and Dusty were going to do, but think of this, Dusty's was, about a man and what makes a man, or what makes which man. And the time period is what Rick had just done that we're going to go through. So I want to talk and have us look at the points. We all have these. They're the events in our life, the little slideshows, when you got married, when somebody important died. And then we're going to talk about briefly to get you to think, which I know you all are thinkers. The prongs, where do you want to leave your legacy? What do you hope to have still accomplished, and what did you hope to accomplish? So that's the difference. We all have points and we have prongs. And some of us have more controversial ones than others. So I've picked a few. There are many to do, but we're going to focus on Marion. And one thing that I think gets overlooked is his Huguenot faith, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Clearly, his grandfather had come here, Francis Marion's Benjamin, and he was a strong and proponent of Huguenot faith. And we're going to talk about that because it was inculcated in Francis Marion, and he talks about it, and others talked about it with him. But then as we go through a few events, and I just picked several that I find fascinating, or at least my tour groups find fascinating. And the first one is this epistolary war, or the other way you would think of it is this is a pissing contest that Francis Marion had with the British. And we're going to talk about that. So it's an aspect of him you may not have thought about. Then we're going to go into, that's the time period that Rick was talking about. And then we're going to talk about this underlying current that's happening at Fort Mott in May. And then we have this issue at Shubrick's related to Sumter in July. And then we're going to talk about what happened in those 7 weeks in Jacksonboro related to the legislature and some issues with it. So the first one we'll use is a quote, and I'm taking these out of letters to and from Marion or to and from Green. And this first one, of course, this is the British Colonel John Watson. And the setting that we're talking about, again, Rick started to get into it. Marion had been ordered by Green to do great activity that is necessary to keep the spirits of the people from sinking. That's his direct quote. Keep the spirits of the backcountry people from sinking, as well as continually alarm the enemy. continually alarm the enemy. And one of the ways he did it was these two great guys, Major James Postel and Captain John Postel. Do I have that right, Charles? The major and the captain. And they were ordered to go back and forth across the Santee when Marion's larger group couldn't go back and forth across the Santee. And what got the British so upset was, as Rick did a good job of beginning that part of it, in March of 1781, he is ambushing in, he's taking pot shots, he's taking off, the Marion is, to the British, exactly what Greene had said to do. Keep the British alarmed and on continual alarm. But as you've read in other accounts and other people, there's this issue of what is the right way to conduct a war and what's the wrong way to conduct a war. So Watson writes a letter that it is difficult to guess in what way you mean to carry on this war. So he's writing it, saying, gosh, Marion, you're really playing this in a rather bad way. And therefore induces me to figure out how to address it. And he says, to a neutral person. He doesn't pick an adult, he picks a little boy. So that's his way of snubbing at Marion to say, here's the message and look who I'm sending to send it to you. It's a very interesting way to approach it. And of course what his immediate concern is sending some of the wounded that the British had back through the line, back down. And then we'll look at a response. Marion says, I wish you'd carry this war as usual with all civilized nations. But further down in the paragraph, he writes, be assured, I will not act in any other way than what I find is done by the British troops. An eye for an eye, over and over. Now, we don't normally think of Marion that way, but there he is writing it in black and white. But this goes on, and by the way, these are just little points, snippets, snapshots, if you will. There's plenty more in the documentation. So enter John Watson, Tadwell Watson's commander, Colonel Balfour, and Greene picks it up as well, but he's writing back to Marion. I'm talking about Balfour. I have received your letter regarding my retaining one of the Postel brothers, okay? And because, Marion is complaining about keeping him against the rules of parole or pardoning. And he says, well, with all this going on, I will transmit back to you his parole, and I therefore trust that you'll use my documentation on the British side when you take it up with your Continental Congress or with Greene or with whoever. And but then he turns around and writes the opposite. Colonel Balfour does to his own Captain John Saunders. As to the Postel, you have done perfectly right. In other words, continue to abuse him and hold him and don't listen to what I'm saying in the letter to Marion. I think you're doing a great job about detaining. And then look at what's in the bottom of this letter. Be careful who you send that message back to. Remember, Watson used a little kid, and he says, make sure it's not a commissioned officer because you know what Marion's going to do. An eye for an eye. Does anybody have any questions about the Postel brothers? And he goes further because there's a battle related to one of the attacks at Georgetown that's launched at Hasty Point, which is above, a good many miles above Georgetown, and it deals heavily with the Postel brother issues being kept between the British and Marion. And of course that time frame is the same time frame that of a little bit later than what Rick was saying, it's March and April. Now we're going to jump back to the timeline of the Huguenots, because this guy, compared to most, some people, religion's not a big deal, their faith's not a big deal, and I'm not making a judgment, but if you read most of Marion and about Marion, it appears that faith was significant to it. This is actually the Huguenot cross. It was created in 1560s, and the short version, of course, is France went to war with itself, mainly the Catholic Church against all the Protestants, for almost 85 years, back and forth, back and forth. And in the early part of the 1500s, 1560s or 40s, they passed an edict, the Catholic Church, and said, okay, as long as you Protestants don't bother us, you can have most of the rights of Frenchmen. And then 100 years later, 80 years later, the Catholic Church and the French king recalled that, rescinded it in an edict of Fontainebleau. And then they said, no, you're just dirty Protestants, especially the Huguenots. Now, what made it important for Marion? See, you can't talk about Marion if you don't know anything about his faith. And what's interesting is this cross was actually developed. Oh yeah, there's a German cross that was developed later based on this. But Huguenots are John Calvinists. They're French John Calvinist Protestants. And Calvin's big issue, way more than Luther and others, was Scripture is supreme. Scripture is everything. So they make a cross that fits it. The 4 marks of the cross, shaped that way, are the 4 gospel writers. That's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Marion knew this. So what is written becomes really important word, back to his epistolary battles with the British. And then you'll see the 8 circles around the cross beams. And of course, the most important part of Scripture to almost all Christians, including Catholics, is the 8 Beatitudes. The original ones on the Sermon on the Mount, taken from Matthew. So the points of the cross, unlike the Catholic or Lutheran churches, they create the Beatitudes. You go, okay, what big deal? No. We know a lot about Marion, right? We've seen it, we're learning it constantly. Well, there's only 2 of the 8 Beatitudes from Matthew that deal with really important stuff that has to do with warfare, and that's called righteousness. I use it a lot in my law cases. I'm one of the few attorneys, and the judge goes, let's get back to the law. And I said, the law deals with righteousness. So the other 6 each deal with an individual claim and a promise. But I believe, don't have all the documentary proof yet, that the 4th and the 8th, the 4th is hunger and thirst for righteousness, for you will be satisfied. Boy, Marion was out there hungering and thirsting for a new righteous form of a country and authority, and he would be satisfied. But the other one is the 8th one, the claim and the promise. The claim says, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness. So when the British officer was blindfolded and showed up at Snow Island, or outside of Snow Island, the sweet potato, beautiful painting that hangs in our State House, one of our 3 revolutionary in the lobby of our State House, and he reports back to his British officer, and it's not to his British command, and it's not just anecdotal, there's documentation. He says, anybody who can live like this, with so little, and be this invigorated into liberty, we're never going to win. He actually writes that back. And then there's anecdotal, and I'm here to posit to you, at least for your thoughts, that it comes from the 4th and 8th scriptural supreme ideas for Marion that he was trained in of righteousness. And if you believe that your cause for liberty is righteous, you can take as much persecution, as much pain, as much problem as you could ever imagine. And people will follow you into that hellhole. They will follow you into that swamp, even if they don't believe the same concept, if they see that your actions absolutely do live that way. So I think we're missing something when we don't discuss the Huguenot background. The other symbolism, it's really powerful as it keeps going. They put the fleur-de-lis in there, the 4 of them. Well, if you multiply the 4 times 3, that's the 12 apostles. So you have the 12, and there's far more on this, but I think they're the big points. So you have the 4 gospel writers, the 8 Beatitudes, and the 12 apostles, who are the followers of a new righteous kingdom, like Marion is one of and creates apostles and disciples. I'll leave that for your picking which ones are which, for a new righteous kingdom, which we call America, free of tyranny and free of related to liberty in it. So I think that, we need to do more on that. It is amazing how much is written about his grandfather, and who was the one who emigrated from France to come here. Actually, he goes to one of the Holland or one of these, the upper states before he comes here to Carolinas. Now, actually this was out of order because I switched to July. I forgot, I guess the gentleman left who left us the big picture of Rebecca Mott. I've got another underlying take here, documentarily proved, but I leave it to how much is going on. There's always more than one thing going on. So you have the battle over language related to civilized imprisonment or temporary incarceration that he just fought about the Postel brothers. Well, actually, let me do that. At Schubrick's, Marion, in keeping with what Rick had just said, that he's changing some of his tactics, and I don't think it went strictly from guerrilla maneuverings, to line battles, but he's moving back and forth. Well, Sumter uses him at Schubrick's plantation. As everybody knows, it's about 2 miles west on the Quinby Creek, out 2 miles west of the crossroads of Eugene. If you know where that is, halfway down the East Cooper side. And one of his arguments that he makes, they have a battle at Biggin Creek, they fights all night and all day, they get down to the evening to Quinby Bridge, the battle continues, it's like 2 battles of a running, and then late in the afternoon it crosses over to the plantation on a beautiful preserved property that's owned by the Bennetts, and that is where Sumter puts Marion in the open field, puts himself in the lane and 2 lanes, there's a public lane and a private lane, up to the Revolutionary War plantation log house or so, with slave dependencies along the way. And then he puts Taylor on the right, hiding, even though he's one of Sumter's men and coordinates sometimes with Marion, he's on the right side of the battle as they approach up this road, but he's hidden by some part of the ridge that slightly falls down to the rice levees. And needless to say, Marion takes the brunt of this battle. And so he writes later, General Sumter's brigade occupied with the houses in their front, which was a cover to them. He's talking about the cabins and the dependencies. While my front, and Peter Ory's, was entirely in the open. So he gets really ticked off about this. And there is the possibility that Sumter moves, the factual Sumter moves across and rests. They leave some troops at the end of Schubrick's. The British are still in and about this yard, a fenced yard around the main house. And Marion's men take off and go across the Quinby Creek again. And Sumter, late in the evening, crosses Quinby Creek with the full intent that when his artillery comes up from the Battle of Biggin, he will then re-engage and attack the next morning. Except the big problem is, perhaps, Marion has mutinied. Oh, okay, I won't use that word. Marion's left the field. And there's anecdotal issues, mostly taken from Thomas Taylor, about how ticked off he was about the placement in the open. Somebody had to take the left open side, and there's a lot written in the green papers related to Marion's position there. So here's a position where he didn't have authority to leave after they both crossed the Quinby Creek again. It's a wonderful battlefield site, by the way, well interpreted at the Quinby Bridge, the little crossing off of Route 41. And he did it without authority. He did it without disposition. And what's really interesting about this comes the other underlying issue. Thomas Taylor was to Thomas Sumter his best friend long before the war, and throughout all these engagements, dozens and dozens during the Revolution. And he also gets ticked off about the position Taylor put him in. And because of that, their great friendship suffers a lot or is strained. And then several years later, not many, 6, the legislature is meeting in their new decision of where they're going to put the capital, and there were several places in the running. One of them was Thomas Sumter's land real estate development called Stateburg, and the other was Thomas Taylor's well-developing sales real estate development called Columbia, West Columbia and Columbia. And of course, Sumter lost that vote because Thomas Taylor was able to convince more people that, you know, we got to remember this. I believe the capital of South Carolina started at Shoebriggs, the mess that occurred on this battlefield, and the split of two friends. Now I'm going to move you back to May. I'm sorry, I got the slides in the wrong order. And Mott's, there's tremendous work on the battlefield. And by the way, the South Carolina Battleground Trust, together with the Mapping Project, together with SCAR, has done an awful lot, almost 8 years worth of work, attempting to try to get that forever preserved and protected. And it has great stewardship by the owners who live there. But, and you could go online and read Dr. Smith's archaeological report about the arrows and Mott, and it's just, I mean, there's so much detail about the siege of Fort Mott related that you need to read up on. But all the historians secondarily miss an underlying argument that's going on. So if you take the mid-20s Light Horse Harry Lee, and you take 49-year-old Frances Marion, they're focused on the property of an actively engaged, recently widowed, wealthy woman who's 43 years old, Rebecca Mott. And so the secondary authors, including from the beginning of the 1800s, they say, oh, you know, the despondent Mrs. Mott, you know, do you mind if we burn your house? Do you mind if we attack it and blow it apart? Well, I think the truth of it is absolutely the opposite. I think these two were having a fight, Marion and Lee, and I'm going to tell you what it's about. It's horses. And Mott is, as any smart, rich, powerful, strong woman would do, she comes up and takes the two boys and knocks their heads together. The trench picture is painted wrong, in my opinion. It's the other way. She's saying, boys, get on with it, get on with it. This has been days and days of this going. And here's what it is. You'll say, where do I get all this? They were having a bitch fight, Lee and Marion, about horses, because they were each going behind each other's back, complaining to the commander, Nathaniel Greene, who is constantly begging for his Air Force. What is the Revolutionary Air Force? Horses. And for all the reasons, fighting, coverage, intelligence, movement. And here's the letter from Marion saying, well, look, I don't believe Lee. Lee's writing saying Marion's keeping all the good horses for himself. And this is just one. You should read how many are in the Green Papers. And he says, oh, okay. And then, like all of our great leaders in the Southern campaigns, including Nathaniel Greene, who offered his resignation up in Yankee Land when he was working before he was working as the quartermaster with George Washington, they resign. They say, okay, I quit. You either see it my way, play it my way, or I quit. There he is. I have sometime determined to relinquish my command in the militia as soon as you arrive in it, and I wish to do it as soon as this post is either taken or abandoned. So the 2 points from Fort Mott, which get greatly overlooked, are one of the reasons they're not coordinating well, and of course you want to know the proof. At the dinner, that's actually factual, that Mott had for the officers after the fire of the house was put out, Lee's men, I want to make sure I get that one right. Oh, Lee's men are hanging some of their Tory friends who have switched sides, and while the officers are eating the dinner in the first floor of Rebecca Mott's house, and Marion goes ballistic when he finds that out, runs out himself, and the last guy cuts him down from the corner of the sally of the fort at Fort Mott, all of which, meaning the sally and the fort, Steve Smith is so well documented. But the underlying battle going on with their commander is, get how this, don't believe Charles Baxley about the 250. Talk to David Reuwer. Oh, you can't believe anything David Reuwer says about that. And that's what they were having. And you're telling me that that doesn't affect the play? Sure it does. And then, like all of them, at some point, they go, I've had enough. I didn't say he meant it, right? That he would quit. He's just saying, okay, if you're not going to listen to me, this is what I'll do about it. Drew, I did this one for you. I didn't know, because you know, Huguenot faith and what we know of Marion's personality, for those of you, especially you, David, who have read it so well, we find him a pretty righteous and merciful guy. But in 1782, as the war's going on and on and on, it's March of 82, Marion's men capture 4 guys on their way from the Waccamaw, which is, on the coast up above, the beaches as it is now. And they're making their way to the Middleton plantation down above Charleston. And 4 of them get captured. 3 of them are killed by Marion's patrol as they're captured. This is March 17, 1782. They were captured on the 15th, and Marion writes, he writes, 3 of the 4 were killed, the 4th, a British deserter, he says to Nathaniel Greene, with papers on him signed by Nathaniel Greene, allowing this 4th guy, Pryor, to make his way freely to Philadelphia. He says, by the authority given to me by the late militia law from Jacksonboro in January, I have tried him as a spy. Boy, 2 days, talk about due process. I found him by a spy, I tried him as a spy, found him guilty, and he will be executed tomorrow morning. 2.5 days, Marion did it. And in the same letter, he quickly moves from killing the prisoner he just found, who has a signed paper of letter by Nathaniel Greene. You couldn't make this stuff up. That's why the papers are so good. He then says, well, let me tell you about the important news. Out at Waccamaw, I'm doing archaeology, lifting 3 swivels, ammunition and everything out of one of the little schooners or boats that half a year earlier the Patriots had burned when Bannister Tarleton attacked the post at Waccamaw. So I guess you didn't know that he was also, Marion was a court-martial judge. He summarily was an executioner after a fair trial. And Drew, just for you, he was a marine archaeologist. And he continues in this very brief paragraph to say, when the water goes down, we're actually going to remove and lift the whole ship out. So let's go over a couple of the points again that we forget in the military complex part of it. And Rick did a good job of making sure we understood he's still a lieutenant colonel. But after the war, actually it hadn't been signed, but the peace treaty had been signed in 1783, he becomes a full colonel of the Continental Line. So these are significant events in Marion's life. He's also, like most of the leaders with good connections and good PR, he's given a job so he can get a nice check. And that is the 500, first it's English money, which is worth more because it was paid in specie. And then they said, no, we're going to switch it to 500 American dollars. And I'm sorry for the color, he's the commandant of Fort Johnson. Remember, Fort Johnson sits on the southeast side of where Fort Sumter would eventually be built. Then he marries Mary Esther Vidot, and if I say anything related to her, as long and in love as he was with her, she taught him how to spell. Sumter's wife did the same thing to him. They learned how to spell a little bit better with them. So when they talk about these women were definitely educated. Then there's the classic Mayhem and Sheriff case. So remember, as we were getting into this battle where Peter Ory and Hezekiah Mayhem have a battle related to who's going to command the units when Marion is in the Jacksonboro legislature, more importantly when he's got other things to do. And they get into this fight, and Mayhem never really forgives Marion, although they remain friends. And at one point, Mayhem's life goes down pretty bad with debts, etc. By the way, the best period for lawyers in South Carolina was 1783 to 1795. Why? Because we represented everybody against everybody else about everything that had happened debt-wise in the American Revolution. So Mayhem takes the sheriff by the neck, takes the process server, summons and complaint for debt, shoves it into his mouth, pulls out a gun and makes the sheriff eat it. Guess it would be easier with digital complaints than we found now, but Marion comes to his aid in a letter and says, oh, this was just a moment of emotionally losing it. And so there's that righteous thing again. And he de-escalates Mayhem, because now Mayhem's a criminal. He's not only a civil judgment holder, he's a criminal. And he talks him down and he de-escalates it and says, look, you've always done the right thing through persecution. Now don't persecute others. So that's a real powerful little lesson. He becomes a delegate to that version of the Constitutional Convention by this time. Can you see the dates? Sorry, 1790. he become, he's a delegate to that version of the Constitution of South Carolina. He's also the person, this was mentioned in an earlier one, he's the one in charge the government gives of South Carolina for the reorganization of the entire South Carolina militia. And then, of course, his grave is a great site to visit, but let's not forget he was also a farmer and a cultivator. That is believed to be the last picture before the floods of what was improved as his log cabin house that he and Mary Vidot lived in. So there are important moments in his life, not all of them, just different ones. Now we're going to talk about the proms, because this blew my mind. At the Jackson Borough Assembly, which lasted almost 7 weeks, Marion is the senator in most attendance until he leaves. So he's a senator. They met in a tavern, they tore the wall down, made the tavern the assembly, and then for a short period of time the Senate sat in the Pompon Church, which was St. Bartholomew's, there in Jacksonboro. And he introduces 3 times, and 3 times it's defeated, public education for the blacks who served in the war and their children, and that he didn't say they'd necessarily be free. He said we would pay to educate them, and that would be done at the state expense. So there's a powerful tool related to Francis Marion's life. He also believed in being the citizen soldier, a concept we've totally done away with. No offense to my veteran friends who I have great respect for, as you know, but we're not even allowed to have that subject anymore. Oh, if you're a soldier and you're in the war and you're fought, then that's all I can do is praise you. Well, by gosh, my concept of the Constitution of Liberty says we ought to have the Francis Marion discussion of citizen soldiery around. Oh yeah, we sort of have it in the Guard. We do in the Guard. But look at the Guard's budget versus the reserves